We're getting ready to start. Welcome to meeting number 78 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research. Today's meeting is taking place in the hybrid format and pursuant to standing orders. Therefore, members are attending in person in the room, but we also have some members remotely using Zoom, and we also have witnesses on Zoom. So speaking the official language of your choice, you can choose the interpretation button on the bottom, and if interpretation is lost, please let me know immediately and we'll suspend until we regain interpretation. For the members in person, as you usually do, address through me, and watch out for your earphones being away from your microphones, also to the witnesses, so that we don't have feedback on our interpreters. We want to keep them safe throughout the meeting. Speaking slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, keep your mic on mute, please. With regard to a speaking list, the clerk and I will do our best to work our way through that. We have a list that we're working with that's changing as we go. Pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motions adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 30th and on Thursday, February 15th, 2024, the committee is commencing its study on the distribution of federal government funding among Canada's post-secondary institutions. So it's now my pleasure to welcome from the Alliance of Canadian Comprehensive Research Universities, Dr. Nicole Vegua, Associate Vice President, Research and Graduate Studies. And we have virtually with us a returning Dr. Chad Gaffield from U15 Group of Canadian Research Universities, the CEO. And we also have Philip Landon from Universities Canada, the Chief Operating Officer. Welcome to all. It's great to have you back at our committee, and looking forward to the study. Thank you to Maxime Blanchet-Joca for this study. And we'll get ourselves started with 5 minutes for each of our speakers, starting with Dr. Nicole Vagua. I hope I'm pronouncing that close.
Vaugeois, close.
Vaugeois,
yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity to hear the views of the members of the Alliance of Canadian Comprehensive Research Universities, otherwise known as ACRU. Our alliance represents 46 of 92, or 50% of Canada's universities. Our members are small, mid-sized universities representing all 10 provinces and the Yukon. While there is considerable diversity in our member institutions, some characteristics include world-class expertise in disciplines that are often closely aligned with the economic, social, and environmental priorities in their regions. They provide a gateway to Canada's learners to access post-secondary education in their region and language of choice. They provide transformational training opportunities, often at the undergraduate level. They have strong ties to their regions with established relationships with industry, community, and Indigenous partners. Several are quite new. They have small faculty complements, limited research infrastructure, and under-resourced research administration teams. We applaud this committee's initiative and hope that it sheds light on some of the historical and current realities of federal research funding distribution in Canada. From our extensive analysis, key metrics from funding competition data show that the current distribution is heavily concentrated in institutions located in Canada's largest urban centres. For example, 79% of all federal funding goes to 15 of Canada's universities that represent 52% of Canadian researchers and 59% of grad students. 20% of the most financed researchers in Canada receive 77% of all funding, and the top 1% receive 23%. Despite our members representing 50% of Canada's universities, we receive 12% of SSHRC, 9% of NSERC, 2% of CIHR, and 4.5% of CFI funding. Canada has been aware of these inequities since 2001, and despite the recommendations in the 2002 study in the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology to address the problem, things have gotten worse. Research in Canada is not limited to a couple of postal codes. For example, our researchers are undertaking studies on a broad range of Canada's most pressing priorities, in health, natural, and social sciences. These include discoveries in food security, wildfire mitigation, emergency management, rural health, homelessness, the toxic drug crisis, and advancement in our resource sectors and more. These universities punch above their weight in terms of ROI on research. A limited amount of funding can be transformational for them. They're also vulnerable to swings in research funding that would be inconsequential to some larger institutions. We support many of the recommendations of the Bouchard report for additional funding to the councils. However, we strongly believe that that funding must be done in a much more equitable way. Currently, the distribution of funding in Canada is often biased because it's based on previous success rates. Success begets success. This limits the return on investment in research, known as the Matthew effect, and it widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Changes to this distribution model are long overdue. And special programs are often launched in ways that preclude participation by small and mid-sized universities. One of the impacts, 90% of funding that goes to student research is embedded in investigator-driven grants. Until funding support is bolstered for students in a way that's not tied to success and tri-agency funding, many of Canada's students will not have access to the funding that they need to conduct research training unless they relocate to institutions with higher allocations. Direct costs must be borne by institutions in order to administer research funding. The amount of money you get through the Research Support Fund is also based on your previous success in tri-agency funding. This leads to small and medium-sized institutions having very difficult time keeping up with the growing number of compliance requirements that are happening at universities, most recent being research security. As your committee undertakes this important work, we encourage you to ask, is the distribution of federal funding addressing the priorities and needs of all Canadians? Is it limiting our competitiveness and innovation potential? Is it meeting the training needs of all of our Canadian learners? Canada does have the potential to leverage its considerable research talent to lead this critically important research, but it will only be possible if we recognize we've designed a system that privileges some and disproportionately limits others. If left unchecked, this gap will continue to widen and limit our research excellence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vaugeois, for getting us started here. Now over to Dr. Chad Gaffield from U15 for 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Hello, Mr. Chair, and everybody. Thank you for giving me the chance to appear here.
For all your work to enhance science and research in Canada. My remarks today focus on the awarding of research funding by the federal granting agencies to Canada's post-secondary institutions. From time to time throughout the history of federal funding for research, this topic has arisen, characteristically when research support has not kept pace with growing expectations for Canada's research ecosystem. As you know, U15 Canada is composed of the 15 leading research-intensive universities that came together in 2012 to create an association dedicated to helping advance research and innovation policies and programs for the benefit of all Canadians. U15 Canada's focus on federal research-related activities complements the work of other associations and explains why we are pleased to be founding members of the Coalition for Canadian Research. Canadians are rightly proud that we are home to world-class universities competing on the global stage. These universities act as domestic research hubs, and they play leading roles in providing industry leaders, policymakers, and governments with access to the global pool of knowledge and to highly qualified, talented people who drive innovation across all sectors. In many cases, research-intensive universities act as catalysts in Canada's entire diversified research ecosystem that includes not only universities, but also research hospitals, colleges, polytechnics, and other organizations. For example, research projects funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund in 2022 include 11 projects, with 6 involving U15 members collaborating with 18 additional institutions. Such collaborations are common in all granting programs, as illustrated by research on the environment. For example, a CFI-funded project now includes top researchers from the University of Waterloo, University of Alberta, and L'Université du Québec en Abitibi-Témiscamingue, who are studying contamination and waste management and helping to devise cost-effective solutions. In another example, the Transforming Climate Action Project is a major initiative led by Dalhousie University with l'Université du Québec à Rimouski, University of Laval, and Memorial University. It is essential to emphasize that the awarding of all research grants follows a rigorous, independent, nonpartisan, merit review process involving scholars, scientists, engineers, and other experts across campuses, industry, and government. Canadians can be rightly proud that federal support for researchers is based on the individual merit of their work, as determined by independent experts with no preference based on the institution of the applicants. The rigorous merit review processes at the federal granting agencies have been continually updated to reflect insights and evidence about how best to make the difficult decisions to fund specific applications. Canada is internationally recognized for its best practices in the assessment of scholarly and scientific research. Recently, the Bouchard Report made recommendations for enhancing the awarding of interdisciplinary, international, and mission-driven research grants, and we look forward to the government's response. The most important factor in our discussions today, however, is the increasing gap between available funding and the growing expectations for and potential of Canada's research and innovation ecosystem. As a result, researchers from all institutions compete for insufficient funds. For this reason, U15 Canada enthusiastically supports the Bouchard Report's recommendations to increase the annual core budgets of the granting councils, as well as to provide globally competitive support for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. A major federal investment in the research ecosystem would better support research activities in institutions of all sizes and mandates. For this reason, the current erosion of research funding will undoubtedly be a central focus of your current study, as well as your committee's continued advocacy ahead of the forthcoming federal budget. Merci beaucoup, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Gaffield. And now over to Philip Landon from Universities Canada for the last 5 minutes.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs les membres.
Hello, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss the important question of funding universities in Canada. Universities Canada represents 97 institutions of all sizes, from research-intensive universities to comprehensive regional institutions to smaller focused institutions, all of whom are part of our rich and varied research ecosystem.
These are pillars of the communities working to solve the complex problems of today and tomorrow, and perhaps most importantly, training the highly qualified talent Canada needs, equipping over 1.4 million students with the skills needed to drive the success of the Canadian economy. Academic research and development is a major driver of Canadian innovation and economic growth. Universities conduct more than 40% of Canada's R&D, producing over $55 billion annually in economic activity and supporting 680,000 direct and indirect jobs in communities of all sizes. But when it comes to research funding, Canada is falling well behind our peers, who have made significant new investments to support advanced research training. The number and dollar amount of Canada graduate scholarships has not kept pace with inflation or the growing graduate student population. It is estimated that each year thousands of recent PhDs are leaving Canada to pursue careers abroad, representing an annual loss of $740 million for Canada. This poses a serious problem for Canada's economy and future growth. And Canada's universities are facing significant financial constraints, both in research and other funding mechanisms. Now, while today's study is focused on the distribution of federal funding amongst Canadian universities, I want to caution the committee against approaching this with the mindset of needing to take away from one institution to support another, or redistribute a shrinking pie of research funds. An approach like this would set us even further behind our global competitors. We urge the committee instead to focus on ways the government can ensure that sufficient funds are available to all universities and accessible to researchers at institutions of all sizes, and that they have the opportunity to submit successful research grant applications. As a first step, this does require the significant investment in the research ecosystem. I think, as this committee knows, we're calling for an increase in the core research funding streams of Canada's granting agencies by 10% annually over the next 5 years. These granting agencies are the heart of Canada's innovation economy and are key to creating a wide array of research training opportunities that cement the in-demand skill sets that Canada needs. The government must also support research excellence and prevent a brain drain of top talent to other countries. We recommend doubling the number of Canada graduate scholarships, increasing their value by 50%, and indexing them to inflation, so we're not having this conversation again in 10 years. These recommendations were made by the government's own advisory council in the Bouchard report and by this committee as well, following the study on the Government of Canada's graduate scholarships and postdoctoral fellowship programs. Secondly, the government should work to reduce application barriers. Lead investigators are increasingly spending less time doing their research and more time doing the administrative work related to cumbersome funding application processes. This has an especially heavy impact on smaller teams who can't afford to have a single researcher pulled away from the research. Recent research security measures illustrate this challenge well. Safeguarding our research from unwanted IP transfers is absolutely necessary, and Canadian universities have become world leaders in building capacity in this space. However, this also puts a significant administrative burden on universities, and smaller institutions receive much smaller sums or sometimes are cut out completely from research support funds in research security areas, leaving individual researchers with limited supports. Le rapport Bouchard recommandait également.
The Bouchard report also recommends structural changes to the research ecosystem to make grants more accessible, including by building a single application point for grants. We support this recommendation.
Though, that even with the removal of these barriers, immediate investment in research is critical for Canada's economic success, and to rebuild Canada's research capacity, foster innovation, create jobs in towns and cities across the country, and secure our nation's competitiveness in the 21st century. Je vous remercie de m'avoir donné.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, and thank you all for being right on time with your presentations, giving us a few extra seconds. A reminder before we get into the questioning round, we have some committee business at the end, so thanks to the members for adjusting your schedules for the 30 minutes of committee business that will follow our studies this morning. We'll start off with our first questions from Ben Lobb from Conservatives for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question is to Nicole Bourgeois. Is that what it was? Bourgeois. I noticed in the list of schools that don't make the top cut, as far as I can see, I'm an Ontario Member of Parliament, and the University of Guelph, say, for example, they aren't in the top level of funding or for research funding. And when you look at the economy in Ontario, I know this is a Canadian Parliament, but certainly when we're looking at this, agriculture and agri-food is the leading driver in Ontario. Shouldn't there be another, and I'm not trying to do Lloyd's bidding here, by the way, but
You're getting extra time on this one, Ben.
Agricultural writing, should there not be more dollars focused on that? Because that is definitely one of the country's priorities, and everything that we can do helps to feed the rest of the world. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that would be shared with a number of other ridings where agriculture is a real priority, and I'm a coastal girl in the island, so aquaculture I would include in there as well. Sometimes there have been boutique programs that have been done with different federal government sort of ministries working with the tri-agencies that have been successful at that. I'd like to see more of those because I think that would get at some of the regional differences that a researcher in a large metropolitan area isn't going to have the same access to, and Guelph would be one of those, yeah.
Okay. Another area of priority, I think, for across the country, but I'll say in Ontario specifically, is energy. And nuclear energy, I know McMaster does a lot of research, but also in the Ontario Technical University in Oshawa, and there's others. Would it not make more sense to maybe take a look at what we're doing across the board here and say, what are our priorities here? What is in the best interest of the nation? And look at funding some of those schools so that we can continue to, graduate and educate people that can step right in and get great jobs in the economy.
I think that there's room for, there's the investigator-led, meaning a researcher comes up with their own questions and sort of pursues knowledge there, and then there's the applied research. I don't see them as being on the continuum. I think there's a nice middle ground where the nation and regions themselves can identify what are the priorities here, and researchers could then be better positioned with the partners, the industry players, the actors, the context that would help them to be more successful. That kind of research, in my experience, has much more impact in the region and stands to benefit more Canadians. So,
okay, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with any universities because I've got probably friends through the years that have attended most of them. But say, for example, the University of Toronto, the big one of all, they've got $3 billion in endowments. So they've got over $100 million annually going into their investment income. And they've got over $30 million a year that fees they pay for these people to manage that large amount of money. Should we not be asking the biggest universities to do more with their own dollars instead of coming to the government and crying poor? I mean, I'm not trying to pick a fight with the big ones, but is that a possibility that we should be looking at?
I think we have to uncover every possibility, and that includes institutions' own resources, the government's resources, and much more, industry and community partner funds. So I guess I don't want, it's a career-limiting move for me to sort of say, pick on any folks there, but I think we need to uncover every rock here.
Okay. Now, the other point I just want to touch on with you is, obviously, it's not realistic for just a big tidal wave of money to hit the smaller universities for research dollars. What would be the right step, the practical step for some of the mid-sized and smaller-sized universities for research? Mm-hmm.
I think I will use the word redistribute. I think that going back to 2001, 2002, where we were saying we were going to come up with some special programs to give some of these new smaller universities a leg up and to be able to compete, that redistribution of some of the bigger pots, particularly the ones that small institutions aren't even eligible for. So all of the Canada Excellence Research Chairs and CFRA funds, small institutions aren't even eligible for those, so that we continue to fund some at the expense of others. And I do think that there is redistribution potential, but we do need some targeted small institution funding. Yeah.
Mr. Gaffield, it's good to see you here again, or I guess virtually. What are your thoughts on the idea of reevaluating the pot of funds that are going out, the redistribution of dollars, and maybe asking some of the bigger universities that have huge endowments to maybe do some of the heavy lifting so that others can be lifted up as well? Any thoughts?
Sure, and thank you very much for the question. The discussion this morning is highlighting the difficulty that I've experienced inside selection committees. One is faced with really compelling proposals, whether it's related to farming, agriculture, food, energy, right across the board. And they have to make exceedingly difficult decisions simply because it's a competition and there's a limited amount of funding. And I want to emphasize this because there's no distribution happening. In fact, these are competitions, and some are deemed to be more worthy than others just by virtue of this independent expert review. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Great. Thank you.
Second thing,
thank you. We'll have to save the second for maybe another answer, but thank you, Mr. Lobb, for the series of questions and to the witnesses for your answers. Now over to Mr. Turnbull for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to have you here and to hear your various perspectives on this important matter. Mr. Gadfield, maybe I'll start with you. You made some questions in your opening remarks, or you made some remarks, I should say, in your opening statement that that sort of struck me. The word catalyst and how these sort of research-intensive institutions that are larger could be playing a catalyst role. And I found that interesting because it kind of gets to the heart of the issue. I did a lot of work in the nonprofit charitable space for most of my career, and we found that there's a lot of competition for limited resources, similar to what we're discussing here today. And you know, so we find that organizations that can be competing for those resources can also overcome that by intentionally collaborating, but also that some of the larger institutions in that space that had capacity could be treated as shared platforms, was the term we were using back when I was doing work on this, that they can utilize their administrative capacity, et cetera, to help smaller institutions do a lot of collaborative, in-depth work. Because ultimately, what are we all about and what are we trying to achieve? It's not institution building, really. It's about the research, right? It's about advancements in research and innovation. So how does U15 really accomplish this? And is there more that U15 can do? Just given this opportunity to sort of talk this through together, is there a way that U15 can do even more of that, lending its capacity and its scale to really enhance, float all boats in a way?
Exactly, and I appreciate this question for a variety of reasons. One is that, first of all, I think it's really misleading to juxtapose little universities, middle universities, big universities, and so on, because when we look at much of the research activity that happens, in fact, the large urban universities, the research-intensive universities, are often acting as hubs in which, whether it's at a regional basis or nationally or globally, they're bringing together talented researchers from whatever institution might be relevant. And the examples that I gave earlier, and there are many, many more, show, in fact, that it's quite an intertwined ecosystem in which Canada needs really those global leaders at the same time as they need opportunities for talent to emerge anywhere. There's, you know, you never know where the next great researcher might emerge, and we want to be able to give opportunities to those to become part of these major initiatives that address issues like whether it's agriculture, energy, and on we were talking about earlier. But I want to emphasize the importance of, when we look at measures and percentages and so on, keep in mind that it is really the big urban universities where the medical faculties are. So, for example, to include CIHR funding and then to assess that in terms of any so-called distribution is very misleading. Obviously, U15 institutions get the vast majority of CIHR funding simply because they have the doctoral medical schools. And so my sense is that when you look at it, it is a much more integrated system that happily we have in Canada, as in the US and Great Britain and so on, global institutions that are playing that role in terms of being a catalyst within their locations across Canada.
Okay, thank you. My understanding as well is that there are much of the awards, or the large, I guess, majority of grants are awarded based on merit, and it's a competitive process. There are some that are allocations, depending on, I guess, the size of the university or how many research chair positions you have, or the success, as you said, of past years. But there's also a large number that are collaborative, or a large awards of collaborative proposals. So many institutions do collaborate. I'm wondering if in the evaluation criteria, and I actually just don't know this myself, in the Tri-Council, is there evaluation criteria, Ms. Fagua, for collaboration? In other words, is collaboration encouraged in the awarding of those grants? In essence, if there's more collaboration, you're more likely to be successful.
There are certainly funding.
Oh, sorry, Chad, I was
This
going
is
to
for
Ms.
Dr.
Bagua.
Vauchois? We have about a minute.
I think it depends on the program, but that's not a standard metric. And I'm just going to, because we keep talking about these are competitive awards, the reviewers, there's systemic bias in here. Reviewers are chosen from the pool of people who've had funds before. So if you've had funds before, you get called as a reviewer. And all of our institutions have examples where they've seen a systemic bias against researchers from small universities with comments, for example, like, I don't know how this person would do this at this institution that doesn't have the infrastructure set up for that. A minor comment like that moves your proposal elsewhere. So on your question about collaboration, some of the programs do have those embedded, but that's not a common one for merit-based awards.
Great, thank you very much. Monsieur Blanchet-Jolcat, pour 6 minutes.
Remercie les témoins.
I'd like to thank the witnesses. My first question is for Ms. Vauchois. I'd like to understand one of the pieces of data you shared. So you said 50% of universities receive 7% of the total funding, and the rest, the other universities, the 15, receive 74% of the funding. Is that correct?
Is it on now? I think it's 79%. I've seen different numbers, 78, 79%. Yeah, and the top 1% receive 23% of Canadian funding. Yeah.
Merci de la clarification. Madame Bourgeois,
Thank you for clarifying. Ms. Vauchois, we talked about the importance of universities in urban and in rural areas. I'd like you to tell us about your experience at a smaller university. Is the fact that most of the funding is concentrated in bigger rural, that's to say, urban universities, does that have an impact on the experience in rural settings?
Definitely does. So, some of that is, and I'll focus on the students. Really, our goal here is to train Canada's next generation of researchers. And so one of the biggest impacts there is for those learners to be able to make it to post-secondary. I mean, we know from studies that rural students are underrepresented in post-secondary institutions. For them, the decision, if they can't go to somewhere local, they choose not to go, and if they do go, it's a great financial burden to the family. They have to leave their community of residence. This is particularly important for Indigenous students. So I think for them, it's the added costs associated to their departure that is one of the most impactful ones for us. I think where we play a role.
merci Madame Bourgeois. Donc, de ce que je comprends,
Thank you. So the fact that the smaller universities are being neglected means that there's a vicious cycle. In other words, it's impossible to develop that funding and to attain a certain stature that would allow you to get more funding. So I'd like you to explain what the barriers are that members of your organization face.
Yeah, that's well said. It's a bit of a hamster wheel. And some new universities like Yukon University, right, Capilano, some of the new ones are really having trouble here because in order to attract talent, you need to be able to show you have some infrastructure to be able to do research. You've got some time to do research. You've got grad programs and students who actually have funding to come to university. So all of that creates a really challenging environment for them. And in many ways, the smaller administration teams, too, for those few researchers, they don't have the cluster of people around them. They might be the only chemist that does stuff on tire toxins, and the other one that does that might be in another province. So some of those barriers, both for researchers and for the institutions, cause real problems. I think the last one, if I can, is we typically have very small research teams, and so a short last-minute announcement on a program or a call, we just don't have the ability to sort of lobby and get everyone together in time. Sometimes because of proximity, I believe the U15 know about these calls well in advance. They have better research teams and staff to pull together a competitive proposal before we do.
merci beaucoup. Est-ce que vous avez en tête un exemple?
Thank you. Do you have an example to share with us about the funding concentration that you've experienced?
Well, yeah, certainly the success begets success. I think some people in here are aware of the most recent sort of research security one, where people had to have $2 million of research support fund coming to your institution as a cutoff to be able to get any, even though we all have to comply. And I would argue small institutions are the weakest link for research security in the country. But I think one of our members got $41 to actually account for. So, that would be one example. The CRC program really is another example, right? You get more CRCs when you get more funding. And CRCs are the engines that drive this sort of system. So those would be two examples of past funding.
Merci, Madame Bourgeois. C'est très intéressant. Ça est pertinent.
Thank you. Very interesting, very relevant. Can you tell us what the impact is of the way funding is currently shared and how that impacts the members of ACRU?
Yes, certainly. I think the biggest one for us is that we struggle to attract talent, right? Talent being the researchers themselves, and talent being the grad students that go with that. We have kind of created a space where excellence is only defined as being certain institutions. And if you're a researcher that wants to contribute in your career, they're making decisions based on how Canada has been defining research excellence. And so for us, it's hard to attract that talent and to hold them. Sometimes they get moved off to other institutions that can pay them more. And, I think it's also meant that we have been unable to get those students. Students want to come. Grad students make decisions on who they're going to research with, right? And so for us, it's a perpetual circle.
Okay, we're actually at time on that, but thank you. And now to Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's great to hear these important messages. I'm going to start with Ms. Bourgeois. It's good to have someone from Vancouver Island University here. My son got his education degree there. My wife worked there back when it was Malaspina College. And just by happenstance, I realized I wore my Memorial University tie this morning because I got my master's there many years ago. So from one side of the country to the other in these small and medium-sized institutions. You went through a lot of percentages and data there at the start, and I guess the most concerning thing to me is not so much, it is the disparity, but it seems to be a growing disparity. It kind of reminds me of the wealth disparity in general in Canada and the world that is going in the wrong direction. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe provide more details on that trend and what's driving it.
Yeah, we've started to really try to take a look. We always look at the competition data, but we've been looking through that over time. Since the 2001 report that I mentioned earlier, at that point in time, when this was flagged as an issue for Canada, the U15 had 63% of funding. So 20 years later, and a few special programs to help smaller institutions, and they're now at 79. So the problem is deepening. And we know that, from some of the different sort of funding agencies in terms of trend lines.
And is part of that, Dr. Gaffield mentioned that, some of that is driven by the infrastructure, the fact whether you have, a medical school type of thing. So is part of that trend?
Yeah, definitely. There is excellent research happening at the U15s. Definitely, Canada needs that. This is, I think to Chad's comments earlier, that's definitely there. But if you're able to get lots of money for infrastructure, and you're able to get 176 research chairs who then apply for funding every year, and they get more of that money, and then they get more research chairs, and then they get more RSF.
Yeah.
That's what's going in the wrong direction.
So that's kind of the Matthew effect that
Yes.
you were talking
Yes.
about. And you know, there is obviously wonderful research going on at these smaller, mid-size universities. You mentioned wildfire research. I'm assuming you're referring to Mike Flanagan at
Yep.
Thompson Rivers.
That's right.
What does that trend look like when it comes to research output, not the dollars spent? Because, you know, I can see why it makes sense to concentrate infrastructure in bigger universities, but you can still do important research without spend maybe $47 might be a bit low, but you know, you can do important research at these
Yeah.
places, and I'm just wondering what the trend looks like when you look at research
Yeah.
output. Or
Well, certainly, I think there's an opportunity for us here to not only redefine what excellence looks like in research, but what are those outputs that Canadians expect from that research money? What are those outputs? Are they solely publications? Are they innovation translations into industry, the nonprofit sector? There's been a lively conversation about how to make sure that our funding is having impact, is the language we use. So yeah.
okay, and I'm just going to turn to Mr. Landon. Your organization seems to bridge both ACRU and the U15. You know, probably all the members of those are members of Universities Canada, pretty much. You know, just maybe comment on that problem of, you know, how much money you get from the CFI, you know, how does that drive this? What does your organization do to try to bridge that gap and keep things fair and growing?
Just over a minute.
Mr. Cannings, yeah. In fact, we represent universities from ACRU, from U15, and another sort of mid-level layer as well. Canada's got a very sort of well-respected research ecosystem, but it is just that, an ecosystem, and so we do need the research-intensive universities to be doing the excellent research, but we also need to recognize that excellent research is happening at the smaller institutions as well. I think there are elements and principles that we want to hold on to. I do think that having merit-based, peer-reviewed competitions is extremely important to ensure that the best research and the right research is being funded. But on the flip side of that, we need to help build the capacity in the smaller institutions so that they can put forward proposals that will be competitive. And so I think it is a constant question of adjusting and managing and seeing to make sure that what our ecosystem remains strong.
Great, thank you very much. And now for 5 minutes, over to Michelle Rempel-Garner.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Landon, your comment about PhDs living in Canada really struck me because there's been, you know, I've seen a lot of articles like Toronto's universities produce top talent, then its housing crisis cast them out. This was in the Globe and Mail very recently. Recently, there was an article about Western University's food bank usage being up 600%. Another article here talks about a man named Matthew Berg who completed his PhD in biochemistry at Western, wanted to pursue being a professor, knew he had to do a postdoc, but then he said he looked at some Canadian universities and he said that he knew the cost of living was crazy and so left the country. I know that the propensity among advocacy groups like all of yours here are to ask for increased funding from the federal government. But I also want to note that the entire budget of CIHR is about $1 billion. The same goes for NSERC. In the last 8 years, we've seen consulting fees by the federal government increase by about $10 billion. So when you think about that, you know, the We Charity scandal was $1 billion. So I'm just going to focus my questions on what policies you have advocated for within your institutions to reduce the input costs to operating your universities, but also to reduce the cost of living on research talent that you're asking for money to support. So I'm just wondering, I'll start with Mr. Gaffield. Has your organization asked anything specifically to the federal government in terms of reducing inflationary pressures on students, like the carbon tax?
Thank you very much for that question. There's no doubt that one of the main concerns we have is that, as you suggest, the fact that funding for graduate students has not kept pace with inflation. We've heard repeatedly that even our
Question I
flagship
asked, and I only
programs-
have 2 minutes. So has any of your member institutions or the U15 asked the government to do something like stop the carbon tax, to tie municipal transfers to municipal government infrastructure to housing targets? Has the U15 advocated for any inflation-reducing policies specifically?
Our mandate focuses on research-related issues with the federal government, and that's our, we
Mr.
make
Landon?
recommendations on that regard.
Mr. Landon?
So our what I would say is that our universities are producing the talent that is doing the work and the important work around looking at inflationary pressures, the political science work, the economic work. The experts that you hear on the radio every morning, they come from our universities.
Right, but you've just made the argument here, and it's in every newspaper, that these people are leaving Canada due to the cost of living. And your organizations come before our committee and ask us for a lot more money. So you're asking us to put money into a system that trains talent to leave to other jurisdictions because of the cost of living. So you see where I kind of have a problem with that. Do you believe that you, in that situation, your organization has a role to play in advocating to the federal government for policies that would reduce the cost of living and therefore attract and keep talent in Canada?
I think that's a bit broader than our mandate. Our mandate is around.
So the answer would be no.
My answer is that it's not really within our mandate around the Canadian economy.
So just to be clear, because I know we're all very curious about this going forward on this side of the paper, the U15 or Universities Canada does not feel its role is to advocate for policies that to reduce inflationary pressures or cost of living, while simultaneously coming to ask the federal government for more money to keep pace with those pressures.
I think that we try to make sure that our role in advocacy and our lane in advocacy is to help our universities.
So do you think that it would help your universities, though, if they could lower the input costs of things like the cost of fuel or heating, or perhaps find their students find housing? Do you think that that would be helpful, or is that a no too?
Every one of our universities is looking at those measures for housing, for being more efficient at all times.
But are you advocating to the federal government for anything on those measures, or are you just asking for more money?
At the moment, we are not advocating to the federal government on those measures.
Do you think perhaps you should?
Perhaps, but I think it's important for us to.
Mr. Gaffield, do you think perhaps you should?
I would like to say our universities are exemplars of moving to green, for example, reducing energy costs and so on.
That's what I thought.
As well as
I'm done. Thank you.
finding ways to deal with housing, provide housing for students.
Great.
So I think it's a very encouraging situation.
Thank you both for your input on that. And now for 5 minutes, over to Ms. Metlish-Diab, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses for being with us here today as we begin day one of 6 days, 12 hours of a study of the federal government funding among Canada's post-secondary institutions. And, I think this is an important study. The perspective of our post-secondary institutions and our students is paramount. On Tuesday, I joined a press conference to add my voice to calling for more support for the grad students and postdoctoral scholars. And today, of course, we're here to study, how can we better support, quite frankly, all the small, medium, large, all institutions are equally valued and equally important in our Canadian ecosystem. Mr. Gaffield, let me start with you, simply because you represent one of the 15 universities in the Maritime or Atlantic, quite frankly, so east of Montreal, Dalhousie. and that was one of the institutions that I'm an alumni of. So Dalhousie, of course, has world-leading battery researchers, and just last week received a $5 million federal grant to support the creation of a first-in-Canada university-based battery prototyping and production facility that should open next year. And I know last year, and I was part of this a couple of years ago when I was in provincial, when federal government made an investment a number of years ago. But just last year, there was a historic investment from the Canada First Research Excellence Funds to embark on the most intensive investigation ever into the ocean's role in climate change. And of course, Nova Scotia is very much situated to be able to, to do that. So this is just a snapshot. There's many things happening in my backyard and in my province, but I just want you to speak for a moment on how the funding that Dalhousie receives shapes the institution's research output and input, and how does it collaborate with other partners in the ecosystem, whether it's in Nova Scotia or anywhere else in the country for that matter, or internationally?
It's such a great question, and thank you. Dalhousie is a great example of a university that is really embedded in its region while at the same time contributing globally. And Dalhousie's focus on oceans, for example, on the ocean's role in climate change, particularly in that project that you mentioned, Transforming Climate Action, working with other universities, Université de Québec, Rimouski, Laval, Memorial, and so on, shows a wonderful example of how federal funding, and in that case, the $154 million for that project and all the partners, is then leveraged into almost $400 million. Earlier, we were talking about the possibility of endowments and other sorts of funding and so on. And what we find is that these projects can only work successfully by in a very entrepreneurial way, finding these other sources of funding. As you know, for the large universities, the research-intensive universities, the Research Support Fund, which helps out in terms of what we used to call overhead cost of research, that is structured such that it leaves the major universities with really having significant gaps to fill. And they do that. And Dalhousie, I think, has been a great example of how they really do work as a catalyst, as a leader, bringing in other partners, really affecting the region, but also doing it in a way that globally is going to have a huge positive impact on climate change. New technologies in terms of ocean carbon capture, new ways of helping coastal communities threatened by climate change. I think it's just a wonderful example and something, frankly, that I think should be celebrated.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. So you've touched on that. I guess my question was going to be, how can other different levels of government and other partners, and I think you've touched on that, contribute even more to make a larger difference with the federal funding also received? And I think you've touched on that, and I believe we do that quite well in Dalhousie, but also at the Mount St. Vincent, St. Mary's, at the number of we have 10 post-secondary educational institutions in a smaller province like Nova Scotia, all of different sizes. So, and I look forward to having some of them attend actually, so that we can learn more about them here in our committee. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. And I just want to
over to, no, we're at time now, so Monsieur Blanchet-Choquat for 2.5 minutes, please.
Madame Vaugeois, mes questions.
Ms. Vaugeois, I'd like to continue asking you questions. What's undeniable is that funding goes through the different funding committees. I'd like you to explain how the small and medium universities are represented in those committees. Are they really, truly well represented?
I don't know the composition of those committees. I just know the practice of how reviewers are called. So, we would have some reviewers, obviously, that have had funding there in the past. But yeah, I couldn't speak to the full composition of those committees.
Merci. Prochaine question va être...
Thank you. A question for Mr. Landrin. Now, you represent the Giants, the U15. You also represent mid-sized universities, and so I understand that you're in a difficult position. You're kind of walking on eggshells. But what I'd like to understand from Universities Canada is that the way funding is concentrated isn't something that goes back to just yesterday. It's been going on for quite some time. And I have the report here from the 10th Committee on Research. It's from 2022, and even in that report back in 2022, there were recommendations on supporting smaller institutions and regional institutions that were underdeveloped. I'd like to know what your organization thinks, because it must be aware of the consequences of the funding models. What have you done since 2022 to fight against these inequalities? Thank you, and thank you for the question.
Aware of the report from 2002, but I think the import of the question is that this has been an issue. This will continue to be an issue, the balance of funding and ensuring that the funding is getting to the right institutions, the right researchers across the country in a way that is fair, equitable, but does not go against the principle of funding the merit-based, the most important researchers and the strongest researchers. This is a question that we are going to be asking 20 years from now as well. It's not something that we will solve. What I would say is that the granting councils, that our universities, that groups like ACRU, groups like U15, we talk about this all the time as to how can we make it ensure that the excellence that is across the country is well represented.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
so I'll just say that this is something that will be ongoing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, for the last 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to go back to Ms. Bourgeois. Ms. Remble-Garner brought up some of the challenges faced by students in terms of the cost of living, housing especially. And yet we fund graduate students, for instance, who do this research largely through grants and scholarships that have stayed the same for the last 20 years. Conservatives don't seem to be interested in raising that amount, but I don't know how you can expect a grad student, for instance, a master's student, to live on $10,000 a year and pay $7,000 tuition. I'm just wondering, most of those students don't get funding from that. They get funding through their principal investigators, through their researchers. And so Mr. Landon brought up that issue of raising the overall grant funding. And I'm just wondering how your students survive, your grad students survive in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Vancouver University, my own university, has over 1,000 grad students, and I think we get 4 master's scholarships. Mm-hmm. So it's always a very interesting conversation, who gets funded and who doesn't. More burden on the university to make sure they're finding funding for those students. But to the question, I think if we can help those students to stay within their region, that helps mm-hmm. their families with affordability. Mm-hmm. And that's what the mandates of a lot of these smaller institutions is to do, is mm-hmm. to serve their region. So, mm-hmm. And then on the 90% of that funding comes through grants. But there is an opportunity here even to keep merit. But there are a number of these programs like CRCs and grad scholarships, the RSF, that are allocation decisions. They are allocation decisions that are based on funding. So there is opportunity to tweak this, keep merit, but look at the allocations in ways that better support universities.
Well, 30 seconds to Mr. Landon. Again, this idea of housing was brought up. I know the colleges in my riding, Selkirk College, Okanagan College, are both very much involved in providing housing for their students, which would help the students, but also help take pressure off the communities. Is that something that your members are doing across the board?
Absolutely. Canada's universities provide housing or help students with housing. The big issue has been in certain areas of the country with certain huge numbers of students arriving, and some of the immigration measures have addressed that. But the challenge has been, is the perception has been the university's issue, hasn't been the university's issue. It's been a private college issue to a large extent.
Great, thank you. And that brings us to the top of the hour, the first round. And thank you to the witnesses for being here and for great answers within our time limits that we are always struggling with. If there's more information, you can always send it in to the clerk if you weren't able to get everything out to us. So for now, I'll thank Dr. Nicole Vaugeois, Dr. Chad Garfield, and Philip Landon for your contributions to the start of our study. And also an interesting discussion around the smaller universities. And thanks to Mr. Lobb for the shout out to University of Guelph. They have a Ridgetown campus in Clinton in his riding. So we both share some challenges. And the Ontario Tech University. Now we're going around the table. So thank you, members, for being part of this. Stay on Zoom if you're on Zoom. We'll start the next round in just a couple of minutes once we've got people in place. It's fun to see the networking going on, but we are going to have to keep on schedule if we can. Pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motions adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 30th and Thursday, February 15th, 2024, the committee resumes its study on the distribution of federal government funding among Canada's post-secondary institutions. It's my pleasure to welcome back two witnesses that are familiar with us, and we're familiar with them. First, we have from Colleges and Institutes Canada, Perry Johnson, the President and CEO, and we have from Polytechnics Canada, Sarah Watts-Reinard, Chief Executive Officer. Welcome to our study, and thank you for preparing to talk to us. We've got 5 minutes for each of you, and we'll start off with Perry Johnson, please, from Colleges and Institutes Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Perry Johnston, President and CEO of Colleges and Institutes Canada. As of month 3, I started in early December, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm here to talk about how we can improve the impact of college research through investment at scale and a reimagined approach. There are 3 unique aspects to college research. Research questions are determined by external partners, predominantly small Canadian businesses and nonprofits, with practical implications in local enterprise. The research is conducted and applied efficiently. About 80% of all projects are complete in under a year. And any IP generated remains with a local partner, ensuring the research results flow to the Canadian economy, maximizing innovation and productivity gains. I want to make 3 points today. The first, colleges are driving massive research impacts in communities across Canada. But we could be doing so much more if Canada stepped up and funded colleges like equal research partners. Let's look at the facts. Colleges provide extensive research expertise to local entrepreneurs and social innovators, with over 8,100 projects in 2021-22. We integrate students within applied research, and we had over 27,000 that same year. And they've helped create over 2,400 prototypes, over 1,800 new products, over 1,000 new process improvements, and over 900 new service offerings for businesses and community organizations. When you invest in college research, you get tangible impact. But here's the kicker. All of this was supported with just 2.9% of Tri-Council funding, or about $109 million across our entire college ecosystem in 2021. Deuxième point. Nous devons recadrer.
Second point, we need to reimagine the value add of colleges within the broader research and innovation ecosystem. Our sector has demonstrated expertise in driving impact, especially in translating research into innovation. But it's so much more, and greatly undersupported by both federal and provincial governments. This must change. I don't want to give you the idea that this discussion is an us versus them debate. Both are critical. We need a mix of research entities with different areas of expertise to drive impact. Colleges need more than a forced adaptation where they are also admissible. We have to rethink federal research programs so that colleges can be full partners. We need admission criteria that take into account organizational differences and create opportunities that are not only academic. And we need major investment, because if we want to increase our impact and our ability to solve some of the challenges Canada faces, it's difficult to imagine that 2.9% of federal research funding across about 120 institutions will enable colleges to fully contribute.
Colleges can play an even more significant role in challenge-driven research. We specialize in addressing problems and can help conquer major challenges in Canada. Think housing, think labor productivity, think climate adaptation. We encourage the Government of Canada, in collaboration with other levels of government, to embrace a challenge-driven research approach that gives full standing to colleges. Define and fund the policy challenges and let colleges, universities, businesses, and nonprofits collaborate on system-level solutions. For example, we'd be keen to participate in a research challenge fund for housing innovation. This would make a real and tangible impact on one of the biggest issues facing Canadians. L'écosystème de la recherche collégiale est prêt à apporter des...
The college research ecosystem is prepared to bring significant contributions to the research community in Canada. Given what I've shared with you today, I encourage the committee to start a study on the obstacles that colleges face to play a wider role when it comes to research in Canada. the college level research network in Canada is absolutely unique in the world. It is a true competitive advantage to our country as long as it is truly funded and integrated as a full partner.
Happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, and right on time. And now we'll go for the next 5 minutes to Sarah Watts-Reinig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and my thanks to the committee for the invitation to join you in the early stages of this study. As Perry mentioned, the research capacity of Polytechnic and the college sector is overlooked and it's under-resourced, and this bears repeating. So when we look at the total annual investments in academic research by the Tri-Councils, it was $3.7 billion in the 2022-23 fiscal year. And the Canadian Foundation for Innovation distributed a further $386 million. The College and Community Innovation Program, the only purpose-driven program that supports Polytechnic applied research, was valued at about $108 million in that year. So in other words, 119 eligible institutions shared 2.9% of the total investment in academic research. At the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, there were 553 project awards in 22-23. Only 17 of them landed in our sector with a total award of value of $15.5 million, or about 4%. And I think given the impact of those investments, the disparities really cannot be justified. Polytechnics Canada represents the 13 largest polytechnics colleges and institutes of technology and about 50% of Canada's college population. Together, that network undertook 3,389 research projects in 2022-23. They engaged more than 21,000 students, and they co-developed 2,678 prototypes in collaboration with more than 2,600 business partners. For every dollar invested by the federal government, polytechnics were able to leverage $2.24 from other sources. And even more compelling than the numbers are the stories behind them. Over the last year, Polytechnics Canada has been undertaking research on the economic impact of applied research. We've spoken to primary investigators and their business partners to understand how their collaborations are driving results. They told us about the value of market-driven research. Every project is undertaken at the behest of a private company, a public body, or a not-for-profit corporation. They come to institutions with a challenge, an idea, or an obstacle to their own growth. And then the partner defines the scope of the project and retains the intellectual property when the project is over. So for example, Sheridan is using artificial intelligence to drive solutions for the elderly. Kwantlen Polytechnic has developed a lightweight hyperbaric chamber to treat altitude sickness in hikers. That market-driven character aligns with federal ambitions to accelerate innovation within Canadian industry. Partners, over 80% of which are small and mid-sized companies, co-fund activities and they offer in-kind support. More than 2/3 say that the research has helped them grow their businesses. Students who participate have a front seat to addressing real-world challenges, both developing problem-solving skills and providing invaluable connections to their prospective employers. And a full 15% of them are hired by the partner with whom they do the research. In addition to creating new or improved products and services, partners say their staff gain skills that enrich the business long after the project is complete. They tell us projects stimulate further investments in R&D, a productivity measure on which Canada consistently lags. So in summary, I want to leave you with a few high-level takeaways that underline why it is that Polytechnic applied research warrants greater emphasis in Canada's innovation ecosystem. First, as a country of small businesses, Canada needs better on-ramps to research and development activity in companies who simply cannot pursue that activity on their own. And this is a sweet spot for Polytechnic and college applied research. Second, despite substantive investments in primary investigator-led research, we do a poor job of translating those developments to the market. And this is where polytechnics and colleges excel, but their capacity is underutilized. And finally, there is a funding disparity, but our research funding model also undervalues pragmatic approaches to common problems. We simply do not prize innovation that is incremental and applied, and I think that is a mistake. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for your testimony. Now we'll go to the first 6 minutes to Corey Tucker, please.
Yes, and thank you for both of you guys for being here today. Just to start off, Mr. Reinhard, you talked about research into common problems. What are the common things that you think Canadians are facing right now that your researching kind of matches up?
The research that the institutions are doing is really based on what the partners bring to them. So it's common to the business partners. But I mean, they're looking at housing. They're looking at the transition to net zero. They're looking at productivity lags and getting products to market.
Interesting you bring up the cost of living because it's very timely, and there's some national news stories out right now about food bank usage up like 600%, and that compounds the cost of living crisis from housing to feeding yourself. What do you feel that the technical colleges would be able to address some of those more real-world concerns that Canadians are having right now versus, say, in 10 years ago, our concerns and common problems that our country was facing might have been better researched at universities, but on the current issues that are facing Canadians, do you feel that your institutions would have a leg up on universities on some of that research, or should have?
I do believe that they do. Now, it's really in the last 10 or 20 years that capacity has even been developed within the college system, which is one of the reasons I think that it has been underfunded and overlooked in the past. It's because it's really a relatively new ability. But the kinds of problems that are occurring today are probably the same kinds of problems that if this capacity had existed in the same way a decade ago, they would have been able to address them then. They're very responsive to today's problems, and today's problems are the ones we have today, but it's also the ones we had 5 years ago and the ones we'll have 5 years from now.
Just on the cost of living, have you heard directly from students attending your facilities about the cost of living crisis?
In general, we find that the students that come to the college and polytechnic sector are coming because it's cheaper to study there. They're still getting excellent education, and they're looking for that link to the job market. And so that's it's not to say that they're not struggling, because we certainly see students that are coming to the school for help with food insecurity, help with housing insecurity, but I would say in general it's also less expensive to attend a polytechnic or a college than it is to attend a university.
Well, with record prices on everything right now, everyone is looking for a little bit of a break. So thank you for representing colleges that have hopefully give value to these students during this trying time period. Ms. Johnston, you talked about, there's a letter in January you wrote to Minister Miller about the international cap on international students cap. I understand that your organization hasn't written that many open letters in the past. I could only find like a handful, so only the most significant concerns you guys put in an open letter, I'm assuming, correct?
Well, certainly I've been in this position at CICAM for the last 3 months. Certainly in the context of my role there, that's the first open letter I've had to address, which was because of a major public policy challenge that our sector was facing as a result of the implementation of the federal cap in a very short time frame.
Do you think the federal liberal cap on international students is hurting your members?
What I would say is that the chronic public underinvestment in post-secondary institutions is the underlying driver of why we are in this situation today. The CAP implementation has been exceptionally challenging in terms of the implementation in a short time period when we are competing for talent from around the world. And so the challenge that we have found is that the need to ensure that student integrity of the program, we all want that. But our concern in the letter, I'll just make reference to the open letter, was with respect to the moratorium on processing, which cut off the tap for international students. And in a market signal like that globally, it can be very challenging.
It was irresponsible, and I agree. What was the minister's, did he phone you after the letter was published, or how did that dialogue go?
So we had an opportunity to have and have continued to have important dialogue with the minister and his staff and officials at immigration. They now hold regular town halls with the community to try to address the implementation issues. But we did meet with the minister with our board vice chair in collaboration with Universities Canada.
So you're only a few months onto this position, but have you met personally with him?
With Minister Miller? Yes, I have.
On this issue?
Yes, we have.
And just switching gears a little bit on the what you're facing with you brought up the percent funding. What do you think a fair percent split between the two? If 2% is too low, what is the number that you think would be justifiable?
Well, I think it's we've been thinking about this ourselves. I think for us the issue is how, first of all, do you look in the context of an ecosystem approach? How do we look both at existing programs, and as Sarah and I have both noted, the college and polytechnic institutions that have a lot to bring to bear are not even eligible for some of the existing federal granting agency programs as they exist now. So part of it is looking
We're
at
actually over time. So
eligibility.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe in writing if we can, or if we can't, work it into another answer. And thank you for the questions. If we can go to Valerie Bradford now for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to both of our witnesses and your opening statements. They were so comprehensive. They answered a lot of the questions I had for you, so thank you so much. I think there's no question that we need both the applied research that the colleges specialize in as opposed to the theoretical research that the universities do. So I don't think there's any question that it's one versus the other. We need both, and we need to try and get, fair and adequate funding for both. So, Ms. Watt-Reinhardt, you were here on in May 2022, and at that point you raised the issue of criteria for allocating the funding, federal funding, with the committee. Of what you said at the time, while the college sector is technically eligible under the Canadian Research Chair Program, all allocations are based on funding received from tri-councils in the previous year. The College and Community Innovation Program, which is the major and often only source of federal research funding, is excluded from the calculation. So could you elaborate on the way the criteria the granting agencies use to award research funding apply to colleges and polytechniques, and what are the consequences of using that criteria?
I think that this is something that was raised in the previous panel as well, that there's a sense of if you don't already have the funding, then you are ineligible for some of the allocations and the way that they're made. And so and my point there stands. If the College and Community Innovation Program is ineligible to be considered as a part of the allocations, it doesn't matter how much they get within that college program. That program isn't eligible, and therefore the institutions are never going to be able to get a leg out. And maybe I just circle back to a comment in the previous panel around this idea that allocations are made, things like the Research Support Fund, that again CCIP is not considered eligible, and so it continues to push aside the research that is happening there for these other allocations. And it's one of our sector's big pushes is that you have to make us more universally eligible if you want to take advantage of the ability of the sector to translate what is happening in primary investigator-led research into the market. And I think that is something that we hear more and more from government, but the point is you can't overlook or somehow ring fence the institutions off to the side and say, well, that's not really the same, that's not really eligible, and then expect them to have to be maximizing their results.
So what specific improvements to the process that the federal government uses to allocate would you like to see, and what programs in particular would be most impacted if they were to make these changes?
One of the things I would say is that the College and Community Innovation Program was developed roughly 20 years ago with the idea that we're going to build capacity within the sector. And so the sector has capacity. And now the problem is you're not using the capacity that they've built. And the institutions continue to be put aside into this is where you're going to get your money from. And they're not more broadly eligible. If they were more broadly eligible, we would still have some difficulty with the fact that publication is not something that college researchers are trying to accomplish. They're trying to accomplish these short, focused, industry-driven projects. And so I would like to see broader eligibility, but I'd like to see that eligibility come with an understanding of the success metrics for research need to change as well.
Okay, great. So in 2022-23, the three granting agencies awarded approximately $2.6 billion in grants and scholarships. The same year, the main federal funding program for colleges, the College and Community Innovation Program, had a budget of $96.3 million. Budget 2023 proposed to provide $108.6 million over 3 years, starting in 2023-24, to expand the College and Community Innovation Program. How does the federal government plan to expand the CCI program? How does it? And have any consultations been held on the issues with the college community?
Consultations do occur. I mean, I think it's something that's the reason for our organizations to exist. Is if the consultations aren't occurring, then we want to push to have them occur. The one thing I will say about the investment in the last budget to the College and Community Innovation Program, it was 3 years of funding diminishing over those 3 years, and in the fourth year with a complete cliff back down to the prior funding level. So you can imagine that 5-year funding grants could not be affected by a 3-year funding. So it's we were not only looking at the first year it was 39, then 36, then 33. The diminishing returns mean you're not growing a program that you're actually taking money out of in each subsequent year, and there was no ability to address longer-term funding grants that gave some stability to the sector. There was no ability for NSERC to address that in the program.
Just to clarify, isn't it the increase that's decreasing and not the actual base funding? And plus which I would think front-loading the increase would be to your advantage as opposed to the other way.
Front-loading the increase is necessary, but we're talking about a program that is under a lot of stress all the time. So the sector has more capacity than it had funding, and obviously diminishing is not growing.
Thank you for getting the additional details to us. Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca pour 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. It's very important for our study. As you know, at the beginning, the study was especially about universities, and then my colleagues were open to also looking at colleges, CEGEPs, and polytechnics. So there is an opening, but I do understand that the challenges are numerous. We talked about the under-evaluation of applied research, especially in polytechnics, but also colleges and CEGEPs, the underfunding, the admission criteria, and the availability of funding. Today, I would like us to look at the disparity of funding within your organizations. So I'd like to hear what you think about the position of colleges and CEGEPs. We talk about fundamental research, university research, but the research that is done in your institutions is equally important. So could you talk to us about whether there's a disparity in funding and if there's a chronic underfunding in your organizations? Thank you for the question. As I said in my opening remarks, what we see is that if there's a program that serves 120 institutions but only receives 2.9% of granting councils, it's just not enough. The program that exists for colleges is much more in demand. There's more demand than resources. And our opinion is that we have to reimagine how colleges and polytechnics can contribute to the goals of other programs that exist within granting agencies. If we want to have a real impact, we've talked about challenges like housing, the green economy, the cost of living for vulnerable people. Colleges and polytechnics have to be seen as key and central partners. So that is part of the funding disparity. We have to rebalance what we're investing, and we also have to reimagine things. If we create new programs, we can't leave colleges out of the equation. They must be seen as key partners. And so we encourage reviewing of the ecosystem. What we deal with is programs that are defined from a university point of view. And we have systems that have been maturing for 20 years that demand a reimagining of the situation. Thank you. Thank you for those details, Ms. Johnston. We have a few details. You say 13 of the biggest organizations represent 50% of the members of your organization. Do you have any more specific data on the concentration of funding in specific organizations, bigger organizations, compared to smaller and medium-sized institutions? In the first panel, we talked a lot about concentration of funding in major universities. Is the same phenomenon a fact in the area of colleges and polytechnics?
It's not quite the same. So there certainly, you've got the bigger institutions have a larger footprint when it comes to their facilities, their equipment, and their capacity. But there are a number of smaller institutions, CEGEPs, and more regional colleges that do, in fact, have a substantive applied research footprint. So it isn't. The concentration is not quite the same.
Est-ce que vous avez des recommandations à faire?
Do you have any recommendations to help and support small and medium-sized institutions? We understand that funding, admissibility are key here, but it must be even harder for smaller and mid-sized institutions to be admissible for these different programs and also to grow and develop if they don't have a history behind that. Microphone, please. I think it's important to think of the ecosystem. We just were able to invite all of our institutions for a symposium. I believe you were there, and about 100 colleges and polytechnics from throughout Canada were present, and that tells me something. It tells me that applied research is a part of the mandate of these institutions because they want to respond to the needs of their communities. So, once again, we need funding to encourage and reinforce capacities in these institutions, but we also need programs to include institutions with fewer capacities in our existing networks. For example, there's a network called the Southern Ontario Network for Applied Manufacturing, SONAMI.
Par le Collège Niagara.
It's led by the Niagara College, but they included other colleges and even invited universities to join the network because they want to respond to the needs of their region. They want to include and involve other institutions from elsewhere in Canada. Thank you.
I know that manufacturing network is doing a great job. I'd love to jump in, but it's not my turn. It is Richard Canning's turn for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for being here. Good to see you again. And I'll start with Ms. Johnston. You mentioned at some point in your remarks about the steady decline of overall government funding for both universities and colleges. I imagine it has a more direct impact on smaller institutions like colleges. You know, and that over the last 30 years, that decline in funding has driven increases for tuition, so students are having a harder time. It's driven the colleges and universities to look for other sources of income, so we've seen an increase in international students. I was surprised to learn that last year, students from India put more into the Ontario post-secondary education system than the province of Ontario. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on this, I think, insidious trend of governments of all levels in Canada, you know, causing a decline in funding for post-secondary education when that is, you know, what is going to drive our economy in the future, help us face the challenges. And just maybe both of you can comment on that effect on colleges and institutes.
Thanks very much, Richard, for the question. I actually put out a public op-ed about this at the time of the international student cap, and I was encouraging that I thought this was the national conversation we should be having, which is the chronic public underinvestment in our post-secondary institutions for the reasons that you cited: labor market, workforce development, economic growth, responsiveness to encouraging that we're responding to the social polarization that we're seeing. Our colleges and polytechnics respond to those challenges every day, and they do it in a way that is defined by their partners on the ground. And so this, and you alluded to the particular challenges in Ontario, which were captured well in the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Report, which there was some funding that was put back into that, but it was not to the extent that is really needed. And I think that we need to we would have much preferred a national conversation on this kind of issue, and we would like to, you know, and use this opportunity today to stimulate that kind of conversation rather than the international student cap. The international student response, and I want to say, absolutely, international students make a huge contribution to our country. We are a country that must be connected globally. We are an open trade country. We're a country of many, many different populations, and we need to ensure that the international students are seen as part of the solution. They were blamed, in my view, for a much more public underinvestment challenge. And so the opportunity to look afresh at the Canadian social transfer and how it stayed very stagnant for many, many years, and that is one of the federal levers for investing in post-secondary, is an opportunity that we can look at. And then at the provincial level, certainly, and we're working with our provincial and regional college associations every day to continue to make the public interest argument that investment in post-secondary at the college and institute level particularly is an investment in Canada's future.
Yeah, and maybe the only thing I would perhaps add to that is thinking about the investment and recognizing that the federal investment that flows through to the provinces is trying to cover both education and health. And these are competing demands. And what we've seen is an emphasis on healthcare, which is another piece that that Canadians highly value. And in response, a message going to the institution saying, be more entrepreneurial. I have no problem with entrepreneurship, and clearly neither do my member institutions. I mean, they're bringing in huge amounts of money from partners, from the private sector through philanthropic foundations, huge amounts. And then on top of that, international students were another piece of the financial puzzle. It did not stop costing good money to deliver post-secondary education, but choices were made. Choices were made at different levels of government. And I would say that the one thing that we've really seen from our sector is a huge move to being much more entrepreneurial about where those funds come from, and businesses that believe in the value of the education and are stepping up to the table. So what we'd really like to see is that there is a bigger, broader conversation about how governments can also do that.
Okay. 1 minute. Okay, you mentioned entrepreneurship, and you both mentioned how colleges and technical institutes work with partners, work with private sector partners to do research kind of on demand. And yet I think we've heard before in this committee how the funding models provided by governments don't really match up with that, and that there needs to be more flexibility. For instance, in the timing, you have a company come to your college and say, I want to get some research done on this topic. And if you have to wait 6 months for the funding window to open, it doesn't really fit with their timeline. I'm just wondering if there's something the government could do in that regard.
We're actually going to have to circle back on that one because we're at time. But let's hold that thought. And now we'll go to Gerald Soroka for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to ask this question to both witnesses. You've talked about partner funding and that, and I was just wondering, do you have a percentage of how much comes from the partners or private funding versus federal funding or provincial? I don't think you have those numbers at the top of your heads, so.
Very much depends on the project and on the partner. So I would say that in some cases, when we look at examples from across our membership, we would see that if it was a fairly large private sector partner, that they would provide the majority of the funding, and then the funding that is available through the government would be more likely to get used on not-for-profit or Indigenous communities, others who come that don't have the resources. And I will say that one of the things about the College and Community Investment Program that we really like is the speed at which funding is delivered. That is, if you're going to do research for the private sector, you can't wait around for 6 months while the funding agency is deciding whether or not it's something that they want to fund. And so there's a lot of effort being made to streamline those approval processes. And while I wouldn't be able to give you a precise match. When we look at the funding that our members get from the federal government and the funding that they're able to bring in overall, as I mentioned in my remarks, for $1 that the federal government invests, $2.24 is being invested by others.
Yeah.
Maybe I could also answer and build on Sarah's answer, which is exactly the case. We host at Colleges and Institutes Canada a survey of applied research every year. And so the data that we have from 2021-22 does signal that close to 60% of the partners for applied research come from Canadian small and medium-sized enterprises, first of all. And in terms of the leveraging effect that they bring themselves to the table, it's almost $140 million in private sector contributions to the applied research enterprise, which is a very important amount related to the government contribution. It's almost the same. Plus, if you look at not-for-profits, also bring money to the table, as well as municipalities. So it is, as Sarah has noted, an important leveraging effect, and they're bringing their own funding to the table to help solve the problems that they see the colleges and institutes can help solve.
So with any of the, call it co-funding projects with these private industries, do you have any patent rights, like a percentage or anything, or is this strictly just a cash in, cash out, and thanks for your service, and that's it? Because I was thinking of long-term, more sustainable funding for you guys if there was some type of patent program or available that way.
I mean, for the most part, our members would say that they have no interest in the IP, and that's actually one of the selling features with small businesses that come to the institutions for support. They like the fact we're not going to keep their IP, and they can turn that into the growth of their organization. They can turn that into obviously commercialization activity that we don't want to stand in the way of. If I was going to say what the real value proposition is for the institutions, they're bringing in faculty and they're bringing in students into those projects. That is opportunities for employment for the graduates. It's also an opportunity for faculty to understand and have a front row seat to the problems and the challenges that small business owners are having, or business owners writ large, not necessarily just small ones, but to understand the challenges that they're undertaking, and that's folded back into curriculum. So that's not something that, these aren't researchers that are separate from instructors. These are the instructors that are being freed up to work on real projects, real challenges, and then turning that around both in terms of work-integrated learning opportunities for the students, but also informing a curriculum that's trying to stay on top of a very fast-moving labor market.
And if I could add one other point to the IP question, because I think that's really key, is that almost 100% of the partnerships led by colleges and institutes as it relates to applied research are with Canadian companies. In other words, the IP is staying in the Canadian economy, and I think that's a really important point as we think about the overall impact of federal investments.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking about like 100% patent. I was talking like maybe a 5% or something, just as a continual means of getting a little bit of money back over the long range. That's all I was thinking of. That's it.
At the top.
I'm not done asking questions.
I wish I could keep the clock going, but we're fighting against that right now. So, Mr. Turnbull, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, and thanks to both of you for being here. Ms. Johnson, it's nice to see you in the role at CICAN. I'm a big fan of my local college, which is Durham College. They have a lot of infrastructure actually in our community across Durham region. They have an EV innovation hub, they have the Center for Food, they have a Skilled Trades Innovation Center, they have a social innovation hub, an AI hub. They're doing just incredible things. I see them as a real asset to our innovation ecosystem, and I think all colleges and polytechnics are assets in that innovation ecosystem. And one of the things that I know kind of impacts on this is that years ago there was a stream of funding for infrastructure for post-secondary institutions, which helped colleges develop these kind of really innovative facilities and, purchase the technology, install the equipment, et cetera. And I feel like that investment needs to now get leveraged, and it kind of goes back to something that was being talked about earlier. I wanted to know whether you've done any assessment as to how not having enough applied research funding may impact your ability to lessen your ability to leverage those infrastructure investments from past years. Any comments on that?
Well, I think that, and certainly our applied research survey includes a look at research infrastructure, and I think you're exactly right. And this is one of the really important dimensions of being locally embedded applied research hubs within communities. Our small and medium-sized enterprises, and you cited what's going on at Durham College, are a great example. They're coming to use these facilities. They're coming to be part of, defining a problem and then working with a local college or polytechnic to address it. And I've been visiting many of my member campuses over the last couple of months, and has certainly come to understand how much they are trying to leverage these facilities for other uses by their SME partners. These facilities continue to need upgrades. They continue to need ongoing maintenance. And this is where some of the challenges, again, as it goes back to this sort of limited opportunities for them through, for example, the CFI program is only $15 million. It's a small program for research infrastructure. And we are of the view, as we've said throughout this session, the maturity of the sector demands a reimagination integration of the programs because there is need. I would say as well that the opportunity to leverage some of the other infrastructure programs that exist through, say, the Strategic Innovation Fund and others through ISED are not proving themselves to be very open to post-secondary eligibility, and that's also a challenge.
I was going to ask you about that as well. So you mentioned the two other things, that this reimagining that you say is necessary. I wonder if part of that is a sort of a broad analysis of all the Tri-Council funding streams and the eligibility and ability for colleges and polytechnics and CEGEPs to be able to leverage those effectively. Would you say that that's one of the recommendations that we should consider?
I think that would be excellent. I think that, and certainly, and Sarah and I both had some very, important conversations that we hope to have with the Canadian Research Coordinating Committee across the research granting councils, the National Research Council and CFI. And I think that is certainly some of the bold, ambitious thinking that we're hoping to help them think about, because I think there's a misunderstanding and a lack of awareness of the strength, the relevance, the impact, and the reach of the college and polytechnic applied research system.
Agreed. And I think is it about because applied research is very different in terms of its, like pure research at universities I've worked in universities and colleges. I've worked in 5 different post-secondary institutions in my previous career. And so I know the differences, but applied research, and there's some going on at universities, don't get me wrong, but it seems like there's a lot of concentration in colleges. And it has unique value. It also has a unique structure. Those industry partnerships that you talked about, the leverageability of the private sector funding, like there's so how do we incorporate that into some of the grant streams that are within the Tri-Council that may not have contemplated that at their outset when they were designed many years ago?
Well, for one thing, and I think Sarah's talked about merit review and the success metrics, the indirect costs of research and the limitations that we have. The other one I would add is course release. For those, the faculty at our colleges that are doing the research are also those that are doing the teaching. And the Granting Council programs right now do not allow supports within their programming for faculty course release. And so that's a huge barrier. And that is something that could be addressed.
Okay, great. What about...
Thank you. We're getting a lot of ground covered. Sorry, man. Over to Monsieur Blanchet-Choquin for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Johnston, I'd like us to talk about how funding is spread out, and specifically about a program that is given to a College Centers for Technology Transfer, which we call CCTTs in Quebec. There are grants that are of $350,000 per year, maximum over 5 years. But in Quebec, the federal government has limited the maximum amount to $100,000 per year. So, Ms. Johnston, my question is simple. Why? How do you explain the fact that the federal government put a cap on the amount for Quebec establishments? It's a very good question. First of all, I'd like to say to what extent we can see that college research in Quebec is very advanced. What I've learned over the last 3 months and on the campuses of our CEGEPs, I can see how involved they are and how funded they are, because there is a spirit of wanting to invest in the province, which is wonderful. The challenge, and this is from what I understand, maybe Sarah can add her thoughts too, is that this program, the CCIP, is different because the province also invests. So because we invest more, we're penalized. What I'd like to understand is, on the part of the members that you represent, it's very unfair because people are penalized because the province is investing. So the admissibility criteria are not the same for Quebec and for the rest of Canada. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because I've heard people get upset about far less than that. Indeed, and what we've said in our proposal for the program is that we want the program to be broadened so that everybody receives the same amount. That's our position. Thank you.
I was reflecting on that as we were talking too, that sometimes when you find other sources, then you get looked over by say, the federal government. So good to bring that forward. Thank you. Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and I don't know if you remember my question, which I rambled on about, but if Ms. Watts-Reinhardt or Ms. Johnson want to comment on that, just in the near term, are there anything that the federal government could do to make it easier to access research funding for colleges and institutes?
I mean, I think that something that we have we've spoken about is thinking about the totality of the existing investment in research, thinking about the colleges and polytechnics as an integrated part of the ecosystem, and then trying to transition some of those review processes, which very much push toward publications, prior funding, something like the Research Support Fund that is available to the bigger institutions, that gives them the capacity to write more proposals. So it's not just a matter of the review processes themselves having a bias. It's the fact that the institutions that have the funding have more funding, and the more funding you have, the more resources you have. And so I'd say that when we start thinking about how to better use polytechnic and college applied research, what we're talking about is reimagining not only like the entirety of the pot, thinking about where the ecosystem can benefit from primary research, and then think about translating that for the market, which is actually the place that our institutions really excel. But it means throwing out the traditional sense of like, how do you decide what is merit? And merit has largely been about previous funding, publications, and those things don't make sense in our world, and yet that is the reason that these institutions are very, very good at the work they do.
I would just agree with exactly what Sarah said. I think, and maybe just on the point of the research support funds to ensure the capacity to be able to be responsive. The research that we have seen that has been done shows that right now within the CCIP program, if you get a grant, you have to pay for your indirect costs and the research support within that grant. So right away, and it's capped at 20%. The indirect costs are higher than that, but it also means that it's taking away from the research grant itself. And that is not the same for the universities in terms of the, so I think these are just examples where definitions and terms and conditions have been defined, they have not kept up with the evolution of the sector's capacity, but also their contribution, as Sarah's noted, to the broader ecosystem. We're really interested in making sure that there is a reimagined look at where our research sector is now to meet Canada's biggest challenges.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today and for your responses. A comment I have, I was at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic High School in Guelph last week. They were building robots. And I used to build robots, and I did that because of my college background at Red River College. And they were all thinking of university, and I said, you know what? The college network is a very good place to learn how to build robots. And now they're going to they won a global competition last year in Texas at the high school level. So we need to support this kind of innovation. And you guys, thank you for your testimonies, and thank you to the committee for giving me a minute and 28 seconds to indulge. But I love this stuff, and I really appreciate the passion that you bring and that the committee members have brought to this discussion so far. If there are additional comments, please, to the clerk. I know we had to interrupt you a few times. But now we're going to move into committee business, so we'll thank you for being here today, and we'll move into committee business. We've got Michelle Rempel-Garner with her hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, Chair, I do have a notice on motion that I'd like to move, and it's given that A, 40% of Western University students are experiencing food insecurity and require assistance. B, the Western University Student Council's Food Center reports a nearly 600% year-to-year increase in Western students requiring their assistance. C, the Liberal government's 23% carbon tax will make food more expensive for students at Western and across Canada. And in order to help students feed themselves, the committee call on the Liberal Prime Minister to immediately cancel his 23% carbon tax increase and report this recommendation to the House. Now, Chair, today's testimony that we heard from many university groups, they talked about how PhDs and others were leaving the country, people that are involved in Canada's research enterprise. And I do think that it is incumbent upon us as a committee, when we're tasked over and over again, to look at funding recommendations related to research, students that are involved in research in Canada's universities, to admit the fact that the inflationary pressure on Canadian students is huge. The genesis for this motion came from a story that the title was essentially that 600%, the Western University Student Council's Food Center reported a 600% year-to-year increase. It's actually, since the story came out, it was corrected, and it's actually 40% of all Canadian students are experiencing food insecurity, and a lot of the attribution for that is because of increased housing, but also because of the increased cost of food. Now, the increased cost of food in Canada, when we've heard many stories in the House of Commons, in various committees, about how agricultural producers are facing very much increased cost of production. So what happens is food costs increase because of the carbon tax, for example, for grain drying, for, we heard about the mushroom farmer here in the south end of town. That increases the cost of food, and then there's fuel surcharges and whatnot, so it costs more to get the food to the grocery store. Then the grocery store has to keep their heat and light on with the carbon tax. So increasing the cost at this point in time is really problematic for food insecurity, one. So that's sort of justification number one. But the other points that I want to make are, for the committee to make this recommendation, is that the carbon tax isn't working. So recent reports have shown that Canada is still going to miss its 2030 emissions target by over 50%. There's some other interesting stats, too, that don't really get talked about, and that's that 70% of Canadians are worried about climate change, myself included, but support for keeping the Prime Minister's carbon tax policy only registers with 18% of Canadians. And I think that the reason for that delta is because they understand that in Canada, there aren't substitute goods for carbon products. So what's happening is we have this carbon tax increasing and increasing and increasing, which is supposedly, it's supposed to transition, you know, consumer choices to lower cost or lower carbon goods and services, but those goods and services don't exist. We haven't seen major transit infrastructure projects built out. I have one in my city that is, the funding was allocated for it in 2015, and it hasn't been built out. We aren't seeing major investments or build out in Canada's electric grid. We're seeing like the electric grid in my province, for example, burn out. And people driving electric cars being told not to plug their cars in on cold days in winter. So it's not to say that we shouldn't be looking for solutions to climate change. That's absolutely necessary. But all of the evidence shows that in the Canadian context, a cold, natural resource-based economy where we have to drive around, that the carbon tax, as it's structured with the Liberals, is not actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it is creating food insecurity for students. It is creating, and in turn, creating problems for Canada's research enterprise, and it is certainly a pressure on grocery prices. So increasing it right now would not be great for Canada. Now, the other thing is, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I do want to draw your attention to the fact that people will say, like, oh, well, there's a rebate with the carbon tax. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has actually done a significant analysis on the carbon tax, and so if we look at Ontario, this is the Parliamentary Budget Officer's figures. In Ontario, as of this year, the carbon tax still costs an average Ontario family $500. And that's scheduled to about, I think it's triple or quadruple by 2030, that cost. So I don't understand where a student right now who is already having to go to the food bank can come up with this extra money. So if it's not working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's causing food insecurity, the rebates aren't covering the cost of the carbon tax, and everybody knows it, why would we keep it? Now, that's a question that you don't have to take my word for it or the words of literally millions of Canadians who have shown through polling that this tax is highly unpopular. You can also look at Liberal premiers across the country and Liberal opposition leaders. So I'll note that in Ontario, the Liberal opposition leader herself has voiced opposition to a carbon tax. Liberal Premier of Newfoundland has voiced opposition. NDP leadership candidates in Alberta have voiced opposition to the carbon tax. And why? Because it's a policy that doesn't work. It makes my life more expensive. And the last thing I'll say, Chair, is that I do believe that the climate emergency needs to be addressed with policy that works. And if the Liberal and the NDP continue a dogmatic adherence to a policy that is not reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions while further driving the price of goods up, and at the same time, in the context of this motion, driving Canada's talent out of Canada, we're never going to be able to address greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that dogmatic adherence to a policy that does not work is highly problematic. So again, you know, I would just hope that colleagues on this committee would understand that, you know what, maybe they tried this out. It's clearly not working. It's clearly detrimental to folks across the country, and it's time to go back to the drawing board. And going back to the drawing board means getting rid of this tax, and at the very least, in the meantime, ensuring that the increase that is scheduled to happen on April the 1st doesn't happen, if for nobody else than for these students at Western University. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for putting the motion on the table and your comments to it. Just for the committee's info, we've got extended support services until 1:30 if we're going to vote on this today. Just to give you that framework, we have a speaking list that has Mr. Tucker, Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Blanchet-Choquin, and Mr. Cannings on it, and Mr. Soroka. So if we can get to the vote today, it would be wonderful, but of course it's up to the committee. Okay, Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her remarks. If she was the good cop, I'll be the bad cop. This policy stinks. Government stinks right now. You guys are not listening. All members of Parliament next week, we are not sitting. We'll have a full week, and I would encourage you to talk to your constituents about this motion that we have forward, and talk, actually more than talk, listen. Listen to Canadians. Canadians are suffering. And if you think that's not tied to your dramatic drop in the polls, get off your arse and start returning calls.
Watch your language. And through the chair, please.
And Chair, I would say that all members, next week, go knock 100 doors. Go listen to regular Canadians and hear firsthand how this policy is devastating Canada. And the motion here today is based upon a reliable news story that shows how our students are suffering, where there's 600% increase in food bank usage. What if that was your child? What if that's your family? What if that's your constituent? It is your constituents, guys. Everyone in this room is reflective in the numbers of use of food banks because of the policies of this Liberal government. The article that this motion is based upon, the research that was conducted, 40% of not just Western University students, but all university students are experiencing food insecurity that requires assistance. This government consistently takes away people's ability to provide for their families, and opportunities, and replaces that with the government, making more people reliant every day on the government to survive, instead of opening up the opportunities for Canadians to achieve their true potential. And this is why it is such a devastating policy, the carbon tax, and why on April 1st, or April Fool's Day, Canadians will be played like fools again, is that once again, we're increasing the carbon tax by 23%. And I go back to what is our roles as parliamentarians is to our best of our abilities to represent the views of Canadians, the Canadians that we represent in our ridings, that send us here to the best of our abilities, share their views and vote accordingly. And I go back to and challenge Liberals and NDP members that next week we're not sitting. There's a great opportunity. Your inboxes are full of emails. There's probably callbacks from people calling wanting to talk to you about how much pain they're in because of the policies of this government. And it is a dangerous thing when governments stop listening, because citizens don't stop. They don't stop. It doesn't stop their pain, and it doesn't stop them wanting you to hear how poorly this policy has affected Canadians' ability to provide for themselves, to feed, heat, and house their families. And I hear the argument, oh, there's this rebate. The rebate makes up for all this extra tax. And Chair, I would succumb that many Canadians, if not the vast majority, is that there's more month left than money left in your paycheck every month, and it is getting worse and worse. I've heard firsthand on families that are having troubles with the carbon tax increases, and it's also troubling on business operations in our ridings. There's more and more business owners that have communicated to me how much of a difficult situation they are in because of the carbon tax. And there are swaths of companies that are on the verge of bankruptcy, and we're jacking up taxes by 23%. Wow. Where does this end? And this doesn't cover, this motion and some of the argument around the carbon tax is that, it's a few cents on the liter, not a big deal, but it's for those people that haven't paused and thought about all the inputs that go into everything that Canadians pay the carbon tax on, and what, as consumers, that we buy. And the example, this is timely because earlier this week I was talking to a colleague from Quebec, and I have a lot of respect for him, but he made the comment, but we don't pay the carbon tax. And I made the example is that, yes, you do. If you buy from anything else from across Canada, you're paying the carbon tax for that goods. So the example I shared was that with a bottle of beer, we're Canadians, we like to indulge in a beer from time to time, and hopefully it's a beer brewed in Canada, and if the chances are that if it's brewed in Canada, Saskatchewan is in that bottle. And if it's the barley that we grow out on the prairies, that producer, before he plants that crop, will pay diesel on the shipping of that seed to the farm. During seeding, the diesel that inputs that crop is also hits with the carbon tax. It also gets hit with any inputs that you put onto that crop, and then ultimately in the harvest of barley out of Saskatchewan, you pay the carbon tax. Then, if it's a wet year, you have to pay the carbon tax on the drying of said grains. Then you have to transport that crop to a buyer, and that all gets built into the cost associated with that producer. And we, for the most part, sell our grains on a world market where we can't charge a premium because it has a carbon tax on there. If it's cheaper to get that input from the States or Brazil, they will, because they don't have the carbon tax. Now, back to that bottle of beer that we were talking about being brewed for Canadians, that is also going up on April 1st. Congratulations, it's going up. The price is going up in beer. Back to that bushel of barley, before it gets shipped to that brewery, that will also pay the carbon tax. That brewery, if it's located in outside of Quebec, will pay a carbon tax. And then ultimately it will be shipped to Quebec for my colleague to enjoy. And he believes he doesn't pay the carbon tax. I'm sorry, Chair, he does. We pay the carbon tax on so many ways in Canada. And the only way we don't pay it is if we import that good, not from other parts of Canada, but from other parts of the world, disadvantaging our country. This is such a terrible policy for our economy, for our country, for our citizens, and I'm very happy to have support my colleague's motion here that I believe is timely and warranted in this climate. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And I think when you mentioned the motion to me, you were hoping to see a vote today. I hope we can see a vote today. We do have a speaking list: Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Blanchet-Jocan, and Mr. Cannings.
Well, Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. For me, obviously, I'm ideologically opposed to what the Conservatives here are suggesting and implying. But I, unlike them, I think I'm looking at the facts and evidence that are very clear, that economists have said. You know, the International Monetary Fund has said that carbon pricing is actually the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. They've said that for many years. There's jurisdictions around the world that have followed suit, and Canada is one of them. We also know that economists like Trevor Tomes from the University of Calgary have said and estimated that carbon pricing adds about 0.15% to general inflation, which is like, to think about it in terms, that would be about 15 cents on a $100 grocery bill. When traced through the supply chains, he estimates that it would probably have about 0.33% on the cost of food. So that's 33 cents on a $100 grocery bill. We also know that the majority of emissions on farm are already exempt from the price on pollution. I know Ben Lobb put forward a bill 234 that was stuck in the Senate. I don't know where that's at right now, but I know that I disagreed with that strongly because I don't believe in eroding the price signal, and I believe that there's opportunities for farmers to continue to green their operations. And that's not to imply, as some have said in the past, that I'm saying that they're not already making efforts to do so. I think farmers are very responsible actors and take care of the land, steward the land, but there are ways in which farming can be done, which are studied at the University of Guelph. I'm sure the chair knows very well with the Guelph Statement and all the work we did on the Agriculture and Agri-Food Committee leading up to the new Sustainable Agricultural Partnership agreements and the additional funding and resources that the government has put forward to ensure that farmers can adopt some of those best practices in sustainable agriculture. And I'm very passionate about that. But I also want to say that, you know, one of the things that bothers me about what the Conservatives keep claiming that I think is just wrong, it's just false, which is that the EU Central Bank not so long ago suggested that climate change itself will have up to 3% per year of an effect on food prices. So that's about 30 times greater the impact on inflation and food prices than the price on pollution, which is really interesting. So Conservatives keep trying to pit the price on pollution against the affordability challenges that Canadians are experiencing, which we all admit are real. They're not due to the price on pollution, mind you, which they keep claiming. They also keep saying that, and they never talk about the rebate. I'm surprised that they even were courageous enough to bring it up for the first time in this committee, because they seem to deny that rebates exist in almost all of their interventions. The individuals that have done the actual research on this, including the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who we regularly cite, has said 8 out of 10 families get more back. We also know that it's the low end or middle income families that tend to get more back. Trevor Tomes also estimated in a recent article that it was over about $300 on average that families net in their pocket in comparison to what they pay in carbon pricing. We also know, like, as a moral argument, I think you're going to lose this battle on every level as a moral argument. Who should pay for the pollution that's going into our atmosphere? And when I ask people at the doors in my riding, they all say the same thing. Industry should pay for the pollution that they create. And that's exactly what the price on pollution does, is it ensures that industry, who is creating the pollution, is paying for it. Now, they hand down that price often to the consumer, right? And so consumers are impacted by this. But that's why the rebate is in place. It's also estimated recently that 1/3 of the emission reduction that Canada can project based on the current policies and regulations that have been put in place will come from the price on pollution. So that's a recent stuff that's just been out in the Globe and Mail. Rick Smith from the Canadian Climate Institute put that out. And I think that that's really a significant result for a market-based mechanism that was originally proposed by Conservatives, who you would think would be supportive of this, considering they all got elected in the last election based on a platform that included a version of carbon pricing, even though I would say our version of it is much more robust and doesn't, have some of the drawbacks that their design had in their last election platform. I also think that, when we think about this, we should consider that there is really significant scientific research on the fact that human beings are the cause of climate change. Like the emissions we put in the atmosphere are causing climate change. And the damage to our economy, the amount of money that we're paying for that damage is just exponentially increasing. The Canadian Climate Institute recently produced a report called Damage Control, and I've read it from cover to cover multiple times because it provides a really significant set of data and modeling that's very sophisticated and looks at, okay, what is the cost of climate change? Which is something, again, the Conservatives are the first ones when there's a flood or a drought in the prairies to whine and complain and want us to bail out everybody and the federal government to step in and resource all of the farmers that experience losses, which is our business risk management program, which is a really big program that's increasing all the time, and we're getting pressure to increase those programs. Well, what about actually preventing climate change from happening and dealing with the root causes of it? They don't acknowledge ever the cost of climate change on the economy. Climate change is going to threaten the very prosperity of our economy and destabilize, it already is, destabilizing the world economy. Climate change, this is a quote from the Canadian Climate Institute report, climate change is a macroeconomic risk that threatens to significantly undermine future prosperity, end quote. I think that's a really significant statement. Now, the modeling that they've done suggests by 2025, which is next year, we'll experience losses of $25 billion, which is 50% of projected GDP growth in this country. Just think about that for a second. 50% of GDP growth. If we want to grow our economy, just think about how we'll be falling behind, how Canada's prosperity as an economy will be compromised by not addressing climate change if the Conservatives have their way. By mid-century, they say it will be $78 to $101 billion by mid-century. That's by 2050. Just think about that. That's 3 to 4 times greater than what it will be in 2025. So in 25 years, the multiplier effect of the damage to the economy from climate change will be 3 to 4 times greater than what it is essentially today. By end of century, they estimate it will be $391 to $865 billion. That's getting close to $1 trillion by end of century if we don't address climate change. I don't know why, but the Conservatives just seem to never acknowledge that climate change is actually having more impact on household budgets, inflation, the compromising economic prosperity of our economy. I can't understand it. I can only assume that it's because they're stuck in the past and they just don't want to admit that climate change is real, which is very consistent with what we heard coming out of their conventions before, where they had a resolution on the floor and they couldn't get agreement on even acknowledging that climate change is real. We had the chief science advisor here. I asked her, is there any doubt in your mind that climate change is real? She said, absolutely not. The scientific evidence is sound and clear. If you go and look at the International Panel on Climate Change, that panel has produced like 4,000-page reports documenting with the most significant amount of evidence and data documenting that climate change is real. But the Conservatives would scrap the price on pollution, literally the most effective, cost-neutral, revenue-neutral. All the proceeds are returned to Canadians. They would scrap the most effective mechanism, market-based mechanism, that they proposed to address climate change. Sorry about that. I got a little bit over-animated. Yeah, so listen, I don't know whether if the Conservatives are just doing this to grandstand today or whether they want to actually study this in the 11 or 12 meetings that we already have scheduled, because we have 5 meetings on the U15 study, we have 6 meetings on the Arctic research study, and then perhaps, and I think we have about 15 or 16 meetings left. So maybe they want to study this further down the road when it's their turn, but I'm not really sure why we should spend more time debating this today, given the fact that their turn doesn't come up for another at least 11 or 12 weeks from now. Or 11 or 12 meetings from now. So perhaps I'll end there, Mr. Chair. Pardon me?
Okay, we're getting close to time, and we have Mr. Blanchet-Chocat up next, and then Mr. Cannings. And
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais tenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be concise and precise. I really like shows, and today we are able to see an amazing show. We just heard our colleague from the Liberal Party talk about the importance of climate change. This is the same party that bought a pipeline for $34 billion to produce more oil to export out of the country. That's the government in place that is trying to have us believe that climate change is a priority for them. And Mr. Chair, I've rarely seen any vegetarians own a butcher shop, but that's what this government is doing. This government says it's green and is fighting climate change, but buys a $34 billion pipeline paid for with taxpayer money to produce more oil to pollute even more and export outside of the country. And so hearing lessons from both parties, it's extremely partisan, and I don't like it. And then on the Conservative side, we have colleagues who seem to be worried about the cost of living of students. Mr. Chair, on March 19th, there was a multi-party press conference on student grants that have not changed in over 20 years. The Bloc was there, the Liberal Party was there too, and so was the NDP. We were represented. There were also student associations, different networks, science networks, but who was glaringly absent? The Conservative Party of Canada. This party that is hoping to form the next government, but doesn't think that it's a priority to increase student grants that haven't increased in over 20 years. If there's any party that understands the importance of taxes, it's the Conservative Party. Something that hasn't moved in over 20 years doesn't seem to be a priority for them. And today they're trying to have us believe that the cost of living for students is of great concern to them, and that it's due to the carbon tax. So we can't trust them when it comes to supporting scientific research, and especially not when it comes to supporting students whose financial grants have not moved in over 20 years. That's all I have to say.
We have about 4 minutes because of the adjournment we had. So, Mr. Cannings, if you want to intervene, and if you'd like to move to adjourn, you can try to do that and see whether the committee allows that.
I will just be very brief. I would say, we're all concerned about the cost of living crisis that Canadians are facing, students as well. I would suggest that the biggest part of that is in the housing department. With students, we also have tuition because of the decline in federal and provincial funding for post-secondary education that I talked about earlier. We've seen a rise in tuition. Tuition is about 10 times what it was when I was in university. And food, yes, food's been going up, but the big increase, when we talk about the carbon tax, the big increase in fuel prices, gas has gone up by about $1 a liter in British Columbia over the last 3 years. The carbon tax has gone up, 7 cents. So over 90% of that increase that farmers are facing, everybody is facing, is because of excess profits in the oil and gas sector, and the Conservatives never mention their friends in the oil and gas sector and all the money they're making now. And the same goes for the big players in the grocery sector, the excess profits there. That's what's driving that inflation. So that covers that. Should we be studying this in this committee, or should we even be talking about it in this committee? No, I think we should suggest to our colleagues in the Finance Committee or the Environment Committee, this would be a great study. I'd like to get all the facts because I think the Conservatives wouldn't be happy with the facts. And I will just leave it there, but I will just... I would just say, let's vote on this. And
do you want to vote on it? Do you want to move to it?
Call the question.
Okay, let's call the question on the vote then.
On the motion of Ms. Rempel Garner, Mr. Turnbull.
Against.
Ms. Diab.
Against.
Ms. Bradford.
Against.
Ms. Kaya Bega.
No.
Mr. Gahir.
Against.
Mr. Tucker.
Vote for.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
In favor.
Mr. Soroka.
In favor.
Mr. Lobb.
Yes.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Contre.
Mr. Cannings.
No.
That'll be nays.
Okay, so
7, yeas 4.
So the motion's defeated, and thank you, everybody, for getting a chance to speak. And do I see a motion to adjourn? Yes. Yes.